cases. That's typical for nuclear, aviation, maritime, and other high-risk industries, health, for example. With the other 20% being things that didn't really involve humans. So we're talking about force majeure kind of stuff, and things going wrong where humans weren't involved at all. So that's a lot to go at. And this sort of data and this statistic really justifies where behavioral-based safety came around and why we focus so much on human error. And sorry, that's my wife's cuckoo clock chiming there. Why we've spent so much time trying to really understand human error and training people, giving them tools to avoid their own error. INPO looked at this a little bit closer and found that, in fact, of the 80% of human errors, about 70% of those were heavily influenced by things like organizational shortfalls, system weaknesses, and things that influence performance. And the other 30% being things that we are subjected to or experience simply because we're human. Slips, trips, and falls. And slips, lapses, and mistakes. We'll have a quick look at that as we go through one of the other slides as well. So that sort of sets the scene. So why look at the organization a bit closer here in terms of where we find human error? And this is the reason behind it. Now, I said earlier, this is a principle-based philosophy or movement or methodology. So let's have a look at these guiding principles. But just before we do, let me just show you this video, and I'd welcome any comments in the chat as to what you would advise as a remedy for this situation. We've got quite a bit of human error going on. This is in the San Siro Stadium. And let's consider, is this the fault of the human or are the wider forces at play? So we've got lots of people taking their seat. We've got multiple trips here. They're all human errors. Everybody's experiencing the same thing. Different ages, different genders, all experienced in walking up a flight of steps and taking their seat. But there's a lot of it going on. So it'd be interesting to think what would be the remedy there, and is that the fault of all of those people, and should we train each one of them individually to avoid tripping up? They're all tripping up over the same step, so there's a little bit of a clue there. Now, historically, what we've done, just before we dig into the principles, is we've looked at situations like this, and this is very graphic and very, very simple, but we've decided that we probably need to train all of these people and improve their movement skills in terms of walking up a flight of steps. So this is one of the first graphs in terms of what's easy for us to do and what becomes more effective and creates what we call more resilience. And I'll explain exactly what resilience is. So the first thing that we do, this term might be familiar to you, fix the worker, fix the people, and fix them one at a time. And we do that by offering some training if they haven't had any, or retrain them if they have had training, because that's going to fix that problem. So we'll retrain people how to walk up a flight of stairs. We could provide some procedures and we'll revise those and probably put a few more lines in those procedures and say you must look down as you walk up steps, etc. And if we get repeat failure or repeat human error, we might even consider discipline and dismissal. But we'll have a little look at that later on in terms of moving away from blame and comparing that to human error. But fix the work, it's an easy thing to do, and I'm not pushing blame out on anybody who's been involved in anything like this before. Retraining, yeah, there might be a need for it, absolutely, and it sort of makes sense. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't provide an awful lot of resilience, because we have to do it to everybody, and we might not sweep everybody up. If we think about the influence of the environment and everything else going on, then we could offer more resilience to human error, so we could make it less likely and we could limit the consequences of it by protecting the worker and putting some things in place to account for human error maybe and protect people from the result of it. So we could have some control measures. We could have flashing lights, alerts and attention getters. So we could paint this particular step that seems to be the problem a different color to all the other ones so that it stands out. We could have a temporary barrier so we could divert people around it. We sort of get the picture. And that's given us a little bit more strength here because we're addressing the environment and the issues that people face rather than trying to address the people one at a time. And that's often what we do, because in terms of resources, this isn't as difficult of a corrective action or a preventive action. So temporary barriers, alerts and attention getters, the types of things that we see on machinery, flashing lights, maybe sirens, something is going on that's hazardous or risky. So it attracts our attention, and then we can have our senses kick in. And because we're experts in our environment, we know what to do with that. The most resilient thing we can do, but it is quite difficult in terms of resources and time in particular, is to really have a close look at these organizational shortfalls and change and reshape the environment so it's easier for people to do the intended thing as they move through it. But that could be quite costly in terms of finance, and it could take a long time. But where possible, if we can increase the capacity to fail safely, so even if human error does occur, nothing really bad results, and we can identify and address these error traps, these error likely situations, then we're probably going to have a much better time of it, and we don't have to drag everybody in to put them through some more training. And this graph early on is just to show where the term resilience kicks in. So the higher up we go, the more resilience we've got. So resilience is, put simply, reducing the likelihood of human error by reshaping our environment. That includes the psychological environment, and mitigating, limiting, or even removing the consequences of human error. So the more resilient, the less likely, and the less likely, if it does occur, it's going to give us a really bad outcome. So that's what resilience is all about. When we look at how we measure the success of the things that we do, we put KPIs in place and we get statistics, and sometimes we find that what gets measured is the thing that gets done. So what we focus on is the changes that we make. And we've probably all seen signs like this, and these are dwindling across industries now. So this is the day since last accident, or the number of days with zero harm, etc., etc. And we see them on the side of motorways when the Highways Agency tells us that we've had 100,000 hours with no incidents. What we're measuring here is the absence of failure. And maybe one of the ways that we can really embed this HOP philosophy and this idea of increasing resilience to give us a better time of it would be to measure the presence of safety, and the presence of resilience and the capacity to fail safely. And what I've popped up there is a simple sort of visual picture of this. If the task were to connect two things together so data can pass across them, whether that be power, voltage, or something else, the image on the far left is probably quite error likely. If we've got color perception challenges, if visibility is limited, and with no knowledge of the task, we could easily connect these crop clips in the wrong way and get an unwanted outcome. Moving forward to the right, we've got the good old USB stick, and we know that we can only insert that into a laptop or a computer one way around. We can try the other way around, but that little blue plastic insert that's a forcing function that that alerts us to, oh, it's not going to fit this way. I have to flip it around, put it in. That's a fail safe. So you can still fail. You can still try and put this in the wrong way, but there's no real bad outcome. So that's probably more resilient. And moving to the far right, we've got the USB-C, which is now the European standard. And it doesn't really matter which way around you put that in. Well, it doesn't matter. It will work. So we've almost reduced the possibility of error and failure there. So that's a real simple example of what this capacity to fail safely and this resilience looks like in reality. So coming back to what I signposted earlier, these 5 principles, we'll start to bring it to life. Now, I've taken the 5 principles, adapted from the Department of Energy in the States, manuals of human performance improvement, and put them into really simple words. If you've had a look at human and organizational performance in any way, Todd Conklin's 5 principles have probably stood out. Stay true to these, but put them into language that I think most people would resonate with. So let's have a look at these guiding principles. And the first one, no real pushback here when we share this. So where there are humans, there are human errors. And there are no exceptions. There are no infallible humans. So we sort of take that as read. It's been around for a long, long time. To err is human, Cicero said many years before Christ. So there we go. It's been around. So human error is normal. Now, moving on to some of the things we were saying here, error likeliness, that term's already popped up for us. Where that exists, those human errors that will happen, they'll happen more often. And that's where this term error trap comes in. That is an error likely situation. And they lie in wait for the next human to come along. So thinking about the video that we had a quick look at the beginning, that step's waiting for the next human to come along and trip up over it, expecting to raise their foot a certain amount of height, because that's normal for them, but it's just that little bit higher, and there we go, human error. So generally readily accepted, those two, no problems there. Now we come on to the way that our environment influences what we do. And what the principles tell us is that our behavior is a product of its local environment. So what we do depends on where we are, who we're with, and how we're all feeling. So that's not just the physical environment, that's the psychological environment, the emotional environment as well. So the environment drives behavior or creates behavior. So that's quite significant when we think about making a change to any working environment will influence the behavior that is a product of that. That's where that resilience graph refers. And now we move on to how people communicate with each other and influence each other, because we said behavior is a product of its local environment. So other people can influence that. We influence others and they influence us. So how we respond to that really, really matters. How we respond to bad news, that matters, and how we respond to success matters as well. So for example, if we know that a task has been completed in record time and we celebrate that and we say, I don't know how you did it, but well done, we're perhaps condoning inadvertently shortcuts. And in the same way, when something goes wrong, if there's a lot of shouting and a lot of negative energy going around, that's going to influence how much people tell you about things that go wrong in the future, if it doesn't cause an unwanted outcome. And finally, all of the principles above really come together in this final one, that learning from everything is available. And traditionally, it's more likely that we learn from unwanted outcomes. So we learn from the results of investigations, where most of the things that were there when something went wrong, they were there when something went right as well. So all events, they have that powerful learning for us, not just incidents. And that's where activities like learning teams, which is learning from normal and successful work, really kick in for us. So these are our principles. Human error is going to happen. It's more likely to happen in certain environments. Environments influence behavior. We influence each other, and we can learn from all of that. So those are our principles. Let's just have a bit of a closer look at each principle. I'm not going to dwell on the first one because I think it's generally accepted. We're all fallible. There's no exceptions. If we really want to challenge that, let's all try and write our emails without using the backspace key. You know, if you've never knocked something over, then wow. But we're all going to make mistakes, and we're all going to do things that we didn't intend, and that's what human error is. Something we didn't intend to do. Now, this error likeliness, some of it is obvious and some of it is a little bit more subtle. And if we tune into this and we look for error likeliness, that could really help us because we'd know how to change things to mitigate that or reduce it. So the picture that I'm sharing now has got a lot of error likely factors in there. The most obvious being low visibility because it's snowing. We've got loss of traction because it's snowy and icy, so we've got low adhesion there. We've also got the fact that this is a white vehicle moving around against a white background, so that's quite error likely for other road users. Hasn't got its lights on. We can dig deeper into this and say, well, where's the edge of the road? Is there a ditch that's filled with snow? That's more error likely because if I could see it, I'd avoid it. What if I'm overseas and this vehicle is a left-hand drive and I'm used to driving a right-hand drive vehicle, etc., etc. So if we tune into and we find these error likely influencing factors, then we'd be able to do something with them in a positive way and make that error less likely. Now, our environment influencing our behavior, again, some of this can be quite subtle. Let's go for the picture on the right-hand side of your screen first. If you're fairly new to an organization and somebody asks you to go and put a red book back on one of these shelves, you are way more likely to achieve success with that because everything is ordered and is driving behavior to match the environment. So I don't want to be the person that disrupts this pattern, for example. Whereas on the left-hand side, if I'm new to an organization and somebody said, go and file this piece of paper away in Bob's office, it doesn't really matter where I put it because I might increase my chances of Bob finding it by putting it on his keyboard, but above that, it doesn't really matter. So it would influence my behavior in all likelihood, and you'll know what those different environments are in your organizations, in your workplace, and in the rest of your lived experience. Influencing each other. Signposted this when I went through just the text version, but how we respond really matters. If I get a supportive response to something I've experienced, I'm more likely to share future experiences. If I get a response like the right-hand side where it's quite negative, I might think twice about sharing all the detail. So this, how we respond to each other, really matters. That can really make a difference when we learn from work, and in particular unwanted outcomes. And we'll have a bit of a closer look at where blame sits with that, and what's a violation and what's an error. And that really does matter, and that's generally role modelled at its most powerful by those more senior in an organisation. But all of us have a part to play in this. And finally, I indicated earlier that a lot of the things that were in place before we had an unwanted outcome, with that graphic on the left-hand side, they're also in place when we have a successful outcome, but we tend not to capture them. We might not even notice them. But if we tune into learning from everything we do, we've got a better chance of capturing these things before they do trigger an unwanted outcome, because they're probably there today whilst we're all sat on this webinar. So maybe learning from normal and successful work is an opportunity that we don't often take. And I know that that requires resource, but if that mindset's there, we could maybe capture a little bit more than we do right now. Okay. I'm going to spend just a little bit more time on this, because this model, organizational drift, really is at the heart of the whole philosophy of human and organizational performance, and makes us think more about what's going on and what is available for us to learn from. So this has been around for quite a while. If you're familiar with any of the Safety 2, Safety Differently, Thinking Differently, Sidney Dekker, he really catapulted this out into the public domain, and there's been various versions of it. So this is my version of it. I'm going to tie this in with the principles and resilience as well. So organizational drift. This is the last of the graphs. Here we go. So apologies for that. Going up the left-hand side, this is the way that we do things around our organization or our workplace. And time going along the bottom. So going up the left-hand side is not necessarily higher performance. It's the way we do things around here, culture, if you like. Now, we're going to set people to work, or we're going to be set to work. We like to know what the standards are and what's expected of us. And that's usually set. We call that, in organizational drift terms, work as imagined, and that's how we imagine work should be performed. And to express that and to communicate that, we provide the people who are going to do this work with all sorts of information. And they would be in the form of processes, procedures, some training, some maybe interactive procedures, licensing conditions. There will be all sorts of things that are in place to establish work as imagined. And we put those in place, and to check that they're working for us, then we carry out our checklists and audits and inspections to make sure that work as imagined is working for us. And what we generally find is that work as imagined is not performing 100% when work is carried out. So there's a reality compared to work as imagined, and we're going to call that work as done. So that's what actually happens, and it's for lots and lots of reasons. It's not bad people saying, I don't want to follow the rules. It's because of all sorts of influences that they experience and unusual conditions that they face. And we find that this is representative, but work as done is often different to work as imagined. And sometimes it's higher, and it's more efficient, it's safer, it's over compliant, etc. But more often than not, it's deviated, it's drifted, and that's the organizational drift. It's drifted away from work as imagined for lots and lots of reasons. Maybe the procedures were difficult to follow, maybe they weren't available, maybe they weren't trained and communicated properly, etc., etc. Maybe the situation didn't allow this particular rule to be followed. If left unchecked, work as done will continue to drift further away from the imagined. We can see there are some spikes there, and they could be after an audit, they could be after an incident. There are all sorts of things that can tune us back into getting as close to work as imagined as possible. Now, all of that is probably no new news to you. And some people might be thinking, well, that's okay. and we've got acceptable deviations from the imagined, and we've got acceptable performance criteria. Well, yeah, we have. And to coin a phrase, that's all okay until it's not, because there's something else going on here that could come and spoil our day and give us one of these unwanted outcomes. And in organizational drift terms, we're going to call that accumulation. Now, accumulation, if left unchecked, is the sort of clues in the title. It will build and it will accumulate. And this is red for a reason, because it's generally not good stuff. And this is hazards, threats, unusual conditions, and some of them are visible, some of them are known, and that's why Workers Imagined is set where it is, to keep workers and its people away from this bad stuff on the accumulation line. But some of it is hidden and it's unknown, because within accumulation, we've also got things like degrading infrastructure, aging workforce, maybe skills fade, equipment and machinery wearing, and all that kind of stuff. Things that when they come into contact with workers performed, that's going to make error way, way more likely. And we can sort of see where this picture's going, because it's not inevitable, but when we get an unwanted outcome, it's usually because the workers performed has come into contact with some of these unusual conditions, hazards, and threats. And that's where we get our unwanted outcome. Now, if we look at this gap between workers done and accumulation, that could be reasonably termed as our margin for error. And the closer we are to Workers Imagined, which is designed to keep us away from the bad stuff on the accumulation line, then the wider our margin for error. And that's great, as long as those performing on the blue line, on the Workers Done line, they understand why Workers Imagined has been shaped and set the way that it's shaped and set. If we deviate more from Workers Imagined for lots and lots of reasons, then we need to accept that our margin for error is getting narrower and narrower. And that's something else that those performing at the point of work, Workers Done, that would be a really good appreciation for them to have. That if I deviate, what does that mean? What does it take me closer to? Not just does it get it quicker, and does it comply with what the current operational vibe is, but what does it mean to me? Now, this is a fairly simple version of organizational drift. There's another line that I'm going to introduce here, because the power of organizational drift as a concept is it's at its most useful when we're able to look at where we are compared to accumulation and Workers Done. Knowing where we are on a model like this is the most useful for us, because then we know how narrow our margin for error is. And the only way we're really going to get that is by getting as much information as possible from the point of work, from those who are performing work, those who live their work-based lived experience on the blue line, on the Workers Done line. And if we're going to learn as much as possible from that demographic, then it needs to be okay for them to talk about it. And if there is any sort of a blame culture or something bad's going to happen to me if I talk about how much I've deviated from Workers Imagined, then I'm probably not going to share it. So there's another line here, and we're going to call that Workers Disclosed. So that's what people will tell you about. I'll tell you about some of the deviation that I made, but I'm not going to tell you all of it, because I'm not comfortable. I don't feel safe enough to do that, perhaps. I'm just giving examples. So that's a real consideration that work as imagined and work as done, understanding the difference between the two, that relies heavily on it being okay to share that. So there's a lot of trust required for that, and some organisations have got this going on really positively, and others not so. So I'm from a military aviation background, and a lot of work is done that is shared. The work is disclosed is very close to work is done, because we've managed to, the organisation has managed to foster an open environment where you're not going to get punished necessarily, unless there was something that you admit you did recklessly on purpose. But we're going to use your information for the benefit of learning. So that's quite a powerful model to look at. And my punchline always on this is knowing where you are on your model is probably the most useful for you. It's not about compliance, because if we look at this and we say the answer is get people to operate on work as imagined, we are assuming that work as imagined is perfect. And it's not always. We never assume the system is sound. So every organisation has drift. The more we can understand about it, the better it is, making it okay to be human, making it okay to tell you stories. Then the more intelligence we've got, the more business intelligence we've got to work with. And because we're experts in our own field, we know what to do with that information. So that's organisational drift. Let's have a look just really quickly. I'm going to open it up for questions in a bit. But in terms of exploring human error and understanding this, making it okay to be human, we've got to really understand what being human means. So let's dig into this thing, human error, a little bit more. And let's have a look at errors and violations. Now, I've crossed violations out and put deviations in here, because I think that's a better description. When we talk about rules not being followed, it's sometimes because they couldn't, and I've had to deviate from what was expected in order to get my task done. So we're going to go on a little bit of a trip through this. This is taken from Health and Safety Executives HSG 48, where we talk about human failures was the original description. So like I say, it's an adaptation. Where we've got human interaction, we can look at unwanted outcomes, and we can say that actually that was a human error, or it was a violation or a deviation from the rule, and they're different things. But I'm going to suggest here that we can be more sympathetic when we get an unwanted outcome, and try and just press the pause button before we go towards blame and accountability. Let's try and understand why there was a deviation. Human errors we tend to accept more readily, but deviations, we might have a little bit of an issue with that. But let's have a look at errors first. And with errors, we've got skill-based errors. Now, skill-based errors, this is people who are skilled in the activity that they're performing. They're working in skill-based performance mode. So they are doing things they've done many times before with a high degree of skill, but they are still subjected to the possibility that errors may occur. So some errors that may occur, for example, we could have a slip of action, and that's simply I've performed an action that I didn't mean to, and it could be because a button has moved or a control has moved to a slightly different location, and I've pressed the wrong button. I didn't mean to, but it's too late. I've already done it. That's a slip of action, unintended action, and that's slightly different to a mistake, or it could be lapse of memory. So even though I'm working in skill-based performance mode, and I've done this lots and lots of times, I forgot to do X, Y, Z. And lapses of memory will kick in for humans more often when we're fatigued and when we're distracted. So memory recall is a challenging thing for humans when we're fatigued and when there's a lot going on. So that's working in skill-based performance mode. Let's consider if we're not working in skill-based performance mode. So now we're more sort of working with rules and procedures. Maybe it's something we haven't done many times before. And we can make mistakes. So we can make mistakes in a couple of ways here. We can make rule-based mistakes. So maybe we interpret the rules in a way that they weren't intended to be interpreted. Maybe the way the rule is written is confusing. Maybe it's really complex. But we can make a mistake even though we're following the rules. So those are rule-based mistakes. If we haven't got so many rules to follow, we're in a position where we're having to make judgment calls and decide what the best thing to do is, and we could misjudge some of the knowledge we're presented with, and we can have knowledge-based mistakes. Now, these are all things that happen to us because we're human, and that's why when we trace that back, that's termed a human error. So those are human errors. Now, we can work with that when we find out some of the reasons why, and we can maybe make our task environment more resilient. So if there is a slip of action, lapse of memory, etc., then it doesn't trigger a really bad unwanted outcome. So we can learn from that. Now we get to deviations, and this is where some of the learning is not so obvious, but we can really learn from this. So deviations from the rules. So a really common deviation is a routine deviation, or a routine violation. A rule that's in place that lots and lots of people don't adhere to. So when we go on site and there's a crossing, a zebra crossing, but it's a lot easier and quicker to cross a little bit further up on the footpath, and lots of people do it, then that would be an example of a routine deviation. Yes, it's a rule break. Lots and lots of people do it. How do we deal with that? Well, we might want to look at the rule itself. So is it set sensibly so it can be followed? Is it enforced, etc., etc.? So that's where a lot of people break the same rule, if you like. Very tempted to make an example of one person, so then we'll get everybody else to follow. I'm not so popular with a person that is made an example of. Those are routine deviations. Then we've got situational deviations. That's when it wasn't possible to follow, workers imagined, follow the rules. So something changed, and in order to get the task done, the person had to do something in a different way, which was outside of the rules and instructions and procedures, etc. Understanding why that is, we can learn from that. And that's very common. Situational violations are very common. Now, if we put all of those human errors and those two violations, the routine and the situational, together, if one of those occurs and the situation worsens, then we can see exceptional deviations or exceptional violations take place. And that is often to try and recover the situation. So maybe one of the golden safety rules was broken because we could see that the production line was about to blow up. And so I broke a big rule to prevent that. Those are exceptional violations, and they're quite rare. What is even rarer is willful recklessness and malicious intent. And these are rule-breaking incidents or occurrences where people knew it was wrong, but did it anyway. So that's without thought or care for consequence. That's even rarer. So willful recklessness, malicious intent, sabotage, disgruntled employee, that kind of stuff. They tend to be easily identified as that. And that is, of course, why we've got disciplinary procedures, and quite rightly should be dealt with in that sort of a way. But everything above, including exceptional violations or deviations, are all learning opportunities. And perhaps the benefit of looking at a chart like this is, when we do get an unwanted outcome, where would it fit in one of these boxes? And is it possible we could learn from that? And is it possible that actually the organizational environment influenced those occurrences? Did it influence a situational deviation? Did it influence a rule-based mistake, etc., etc.? So this can be really helpful in moving as far away from blame as we possibly can, and deep into the learning zone, which is where we want to be. Okay, so that's a relationship between errors and deviations. But we've got more than one type of human error, and this is sort of where we're going to sort of close out here. Thinking about the things that are in place when we get unwanted outcomes. We've got more than one type of error. We've got these active errors, which everybody sees. And for example, the consequence is immediate and it's easy to see who's involved. If you're a blamer, this is gold dust, because there's only one person up a tree with a chainsaw, and so that's the person we can blame. So there we go. Dead easy to find out who's involved. I'm sure that person with a chainsaw did not mean to have that unwanted outcome. What's more difficult, but is a human error just the same, are these latent errors that are made that people don't know they've made them, and often the consequence of that error remains hidden until it comes into contact with something else. So when we looked at organizational drift, we had that accumulation line. That's peppered with latent conditions, which are as a result of latent errors. Errors that people experienced without knowing it. So the example I've got here is, imagine a scenario where we've got people working on site and they've got a lot of loose nails and screws, and inadvertently drop a couple of them in an area where vehicles move around. So the picture on the left-hand side is a screw in a tyre. Maybe we've experienced that, maybe not, but can be quite costly. But we don't know about it. We don't know about it until the consequence shows itself often later on. And a little bit like that picture on the right-hand side. We return to our vehicle and we notice that there's not enough air in the tyre. Then we've got a problem. But everything that happened up to that point, we didn't know anything was wrong. And that is a really good example of latent errors producing latent conditions, which later on they produce something that we notice. But we're probably not going to find out who was involved, who dropped the screw. So the answer to avoiding some of those latent conditions is to create environments where it's made difficult to lose control of small items like screws or nails, for example, or we prohibit them being used openly in an area where vehicles are then going to transit, or we sweep up that. There's lots and lots of things we can do, but in that scenario, those are just the examples. Latent errors, latent conditions, there will be lots and lots and lots of them out there in your workplace and in your domestic environment. And then when something happens, it's a surprise to us all, but the condition that caused it has been there probably for a long time. These error traps that we spoke about, go and find your error traps, error likely situations. They are a combination of all sorts of things. So quick scenario, we have a load of vending machines installed, and whoever fits them inadvertently fits a drain pipe the wrong way around, because that was easy for them to do because it wasn't labeled correctly, etc., etc. So this was probably a rule-based mistake, as we look at that graph before. But anyway, we've had a latent error. Produces a latent condition, starts a slow leak, creates a bit of a puddle. Then we get accumulation kicking in. So we're going back to our organizational drift model here. We're not cleaning up as often as we used to do because we've had a bit of a lean exercise and we've cut back on cleaning costs. So this puddle that was developing, it's not getting mopped up as often as it was before. Let's say we've got more people coming into the canteen because we've got a bit of a busy time, etc., etc. We can see what's coming. The likelihood of slipping near the vending machine is now very high, and that is an error trap. That's an error likely situation. And I'm sure there are lots of pictures that you could put in place of these. Some of these things will exist out there in our workspaces. The use of human performance tools, not going to go into those in great detail, but we can shape our environment to be as resilient to human error as possible. We can complement that with the use of human performance tools so that people moving around environments become more situationally aware, they notice more, they ask more questions, they validate assumptions, they understand what they're working with, and it's okay to talk about that. That's really what the human performance tools would enable. But within the time that we've been given, we can't go into the depths of that, but that would be something that the people closest to the point of work could use to help navigate through an environment that the rest of the organization has shaped to be as least error likely as possible and as resilient as possible. So that's the whole premise of human and organizational performance, making it okay to be human in organizations. There's a lot of moving parts to it, but hopefully that's given more of an insight into the theory behind it and some of the ways that we can look at it. So at that point, I'm going to stop sharing, and if there are any questions, comments, time for a bit of a chat and make more sense of it, now's the time to do it.
Oh, thanks ever so much, Andy. It was a really comprehensive and informative session. So just to remind people, if you want to put any questions, do so in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or in the chat box, and I'll pick those up. But we do have a couple to start with. So how do we actually start our HOP journey, and how do we get everybody on board with it?
Okay, so it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but when we think about principle number 4 and how you respond really, really matters, it's crucial to get leadership buy-in and get leadership to understand what integrating HOP would mean to them. Because if their response is not going to support that, then we're going to struggle a little bit. Almost like if you're going to make it okay to be human in an organization, and it's okay to talk about what really happens, are the senior leaders ready to hear that? That's sort of where it goes. So it's a top-down, bottom-up approach. In my experience, learning from normal and successful work is a great way to introduce. That's a great starting point because it's generally more okay to talk about success. So I'm more likely to say how I really perform this task because nothing's gone wrong, so I'm probably not going to get blamed.
Okay, great answer, thank you. Somebody's just commented that they felt that understanding the human factor makes us value the importance of the hard barriers and ensuring its functionality.
Yeah, and that's a great comment. Yeah, because sometimes it's really important for people to understand why things are there or why certain procedures are written the way they're written. So my best example of that, because I really like that, is expressing something in a language that makes it easy to understand the reason for what you're expressing. So a lot of organizations have reverse parking policy. So they say, you must reverse park. Now, why do we reverse park? So that when we come out of our parking space, we can see what we're doing and we don't run anybody over, for example, or hit another car. I went to visit a client last year, and in the joining instructions, it said our policy is to park in a manner which makes it easy to drive forwards out of your parking space. And that really sort of, yeah, you're joining all the dots together there, and I understand why you're asking me to do that. So, yeah, highlighting where some of the barriers and some of the things are in place and the reason why, yeah, is absolutely, it's going to be helpful, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question is all about reporting. So this person works in an organisation which they describe as being very report heavy. So how can they integrate reporting processes into HOP? How do they marry the two? Is it easy to do?
And that is a really, really common question, and there are lots of different approaches to reporting. Making it more okay to be human in an organisation, making it okay to talk about what really goes on around here, makes voluntary reporting a lot easier for people. If we say we just want more volume of reporting, but we don't try and make it more okay to talk about what really happens, what we can get is low quality reporting. So if I have to produce 10 observation reports per month, and that's linked to some sort of reward or bonus or whatever, I probably will produce 10, but the quality of them, well, certainly of the last sort of 8 or 9, might be quite low. So I would avoid putting a tally on it, and I'd avoid putting a target on it. I'd go out and I'd ask a lot of questions. So I would have frontline leaders and EHS advisors, for example, asking questions and trying to elicit some observations and some reporting. And I would absolutely reward good quality reports, and I'd highlight it and I'd share how positive that is for the organisation. It's an ongoing thing, reporting.
Okay, thank you. So this person is a manager within their team, the manager of a team, and they want to know how they can respond to failure within the team better.
I think and I think I'm right in saying that we can share the slide pack afterwards. Yep. Okay. So the chart that shows the relationship between errors and deviations is a really good one to refer to when you respond to something. So if you're the person who is going to be looking at what to do after an unwanted outcome, that is a really good reference to look at and say, right, where could it fit here? My best advice in practical terms is ask questions about the things that were around when the unwanted outcome happened. Not the people involved, but the things. How hot it was, how busy it was, what tools we were working with, what was the site like, all of those things before we even ask any questions about who was there, to try and limit the emotional connection or any sort of blame language coming out. Talk about things before people would be my one-liner on that.
Okay, great, thank you. And sort of linked to that is, if we want to address organisational drift or deviations, that surely must mean there needs to be a shift in thinking in our employees and our teams. How do we engage with our employees to make that shift in thinking?
So again, that sort of cliche answer, buy-in, first of all, buy-in, and then role modeling the HOP philosophy by leaders would encourage more communication from people at the point of work. So it's almost like create the environment and behavior will follow, which is part of the philosophy. It really does focus on if we're going to do this, we all need to shape the environment, and I'm talking about the psychological environment in the same way. So it really does matter that we have good role modeling and consistent role modeling of the HOP philosophy is a good concept for us, and then you would like to think that the behavior is a result of that.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we've stimulated a bit of debate about HOP in general, and somebody's asked whether you've got any sort of recommendations for further reading on hop that might be of use.
I have. So, I mean, if you really want to dig into the detail, there is. Can we make these resources available through you?
I can email them out to people. Yes.
Okay, so I can give these resources to you. So, the Department of Energy in the United States. This is all public domain information. The Department of Energy in the United States has 2 volumes of human performance improvement, and they're about that thick. Now, they are a detailed read. There's lots of information. There's one document that's recently come out from Norsk Industry, and this is a public domain body that is for the good of industry, all about hop. It's a hop guide. Because it's been translated from Norwegian into English, it's simplified and it's very, very well written. And I would recommend looking at that as probably a first point of call. There are some great books out there. We've got Todd Conklin's 5 Principles of Hop, a lot of Decker's books. There's a great book, The 4 Ds of Thinking Differently. If it's dangerous, if it's dumb, if it's difficult, or if it's different, then we start to look at some of the hop principles. But yeah, I can signpost all of those. There's a lot out there. Good old Google will give you some good returns.
That's lovely, thank you. Another question then is basically then what we need to think about is the difference between unsafe acts and unsafe conditions. For example, was the trip step in the football stadium an unsafe condition and not the fault of the people?
I would say absolutely, yeah. In my opinion, yeah, it's an unsafe condition. It's an error trap. It's waiting for the next human to come along. So where we have repeat failure or repeat incident, it's more likely not 2 incidents of people performing unsafe acts. It's probably 2 incidents of people being exposed to the same conditions. I'd always go for conditions first where possible.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you very much. I'm just seeing if we've got any more comments or questions. Now's your chance if you've got something to ask, Andy. Let's give it a few more seconds. No, I think we've done with all the questions, and so I think we'll end here for this afternoon. Thank you ever so much, Andy, for sharing your knowledge with us. Been fascinating insight into hop. Thanks to everybody that's joined us today, and the recording will be on the IIRSM Resource Hub and website. So if you're a IIRSM member, you can access it at any time. Somebody's just said they really enjoyed it. Great, thank you. So that's a nice bit of comments.
Good, thanks for that. Yeah,
no, people are saying very, very informative. So that's great to get that immediate feedback. So we'll end the webinar here. Thank you ever so much for joining us. Thanks again, Andy, and we hope to see you very soon at the next IIRSM webinar. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. Have a great Christmas.